Edgar Cayce was a famous 20th century Christian mystic who regularly entered an altered state of consciousness from which he answered questions and gave information on a broad range of topics. His psychic dissertations included historic data on famous and completely unknown people and events. Within this broad array of material was a generous amount of detail about the history of France, including many of the people, places, and events recognized by mainstream historians. But there was also much information on the inner lives of individuals, their thoughts, feelings, and motivations. The inner, subjective aspect of history is the soul dimension of human experience that is inherently more difficult and often impossible to ascertain with any confidence due to the lack of concrete historical artifacts and documents. This is where the Cayce readings may have some value. When asked about the source of the information, Cayce responded that the thoughts, actions, and intents of each individual are recorded in the skein of space and time called the Akashic Records, also known as God's Book of Remembrance and the Book of Life. Cayce claimed to be able to read the Akashic Records during his trance states, thus his psychic discourses became known as readings. The readings were assigned numbers to protect the privacy of those who sought his guidance. Of course, the question is whether such psychically derived information has any place in the study of history, as it is currently conceived and practiced. Or is it something entirely apart and not at all relevant? History is defined as the study of past events. Public history typically relates to a particular subject, place, or group of people. Usually, historical research is based on written records or archaeological data in some form or other that are publicly available. Within the scope of such information, there is data pertaining to personal history that may include confidential information such as medical records or employment data. Edgar Cayce provided life readings that stretched the concept of personal history much further to include past life scenarios, in other words, reincarnation. What makes these psychic discourses particularly fascinating is that the personal, subjective, soul dimension of history is embedded and interwoven within the fabric of objective public history. The key to understanding the Cayce perspective of history in this broader sense is to recognize the soul dimension of experience and appreciate the importance of soul development. The earth experience is like a classroom in which the soul learns and grows in consciousness, even though some of the lessons are difficult and painful. Soul experience is not isolated, but rather embedded in relationships with other souls who tend to incarnate together in groups. Apparently, this is the most effective means of development, where activities from past lives are reflected in future incarnations with the same individuals. Thus, karma, the law of cause and effect at the soul level, comes into play as each soul is able to meet itself and grow. The social dimension of soul group activities is part of a broader context of soul experience at the level of peoples or nations that tends to focus on certain shared beliefs and values associated with ideals. Thus, the spirit of a people, collectively, builds a pattern in the skein of space and time comprising the fabric of what we commonly call history. Furthermore, the Cayce readings observe that there are patterns of consciousness associated with groups of peoples and nations. So one can even postulate gestalts of consciousness, leading to a spiritual perspective on the meaning of history at multiple levels. Since most of the Cayce readings that discuss human history are provided as part of a life reading for an individual, who in turn is a member of a soul group, the historical periods described in the readings tend to be episodic rather than continuous in terms of chronology. In other words, Cayce seldom gave readings on a period of history laid out in a chronological listing of people and events. Rather, the psychic perceptions tend to be episodic, clusters of individual stories around a core, soul groups dipping in and out of space-time with issues to be worked out with other members of the group. Each of the sections that we will explore is essentially a composite made up of multiple perspectives, each remarkably consistent with the readings for other individuals, despite many years between the readings. The personal stories are like facets on a gemstone, some rough and a bit crude, some highly polished with great detail and sophistication. So there is some inherent unevenness in the coverage, but that comes with the territory. All data provided in the life readings was chosen by the unconscious Cayce so as to be relevant to the current lives of individuals. So this perspective of history is somewhat biased, since the purpose of individual readings was to facilitate soul development by maximizing the virtues and minimizing the faults of each individual. Because this is not a complete history given in chronological order, there are gaps and holes to be sure, because the information is determined by those who chose to come to Cayce for readings, hence part of a larger soul group that included Cayce himself. With this bit of background, I hope you enjoy and benefit from this glimpse into the reincarnational history of France.